Good evening and thank you for watching. In yesterday's reading, Matthew 24, Jesus answers two questions asked by his disciples. The first question has to do with the temple. When will it be destroyed? Because they've just come out of the temple area and they're remarking at how beautiful this temple is. And Jesus says, I tell you, not one stone will be left upon another. So they want to know, when is the temple going to be destroyed? And the other question they ask is, what will be the signs of the end time? Well, we have the benefit of history, don't we? So we know that the temple was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. But Jesus says to the 12, there will be a lot of signs that point to the coming destruction. So you need to keep your eyes open. And he says that the primary sign is going to be what he calls an abomination that brings desolation. Prophesied by Daniel, Jesus says, standing in the holy place. And in AD 70, Titus and the Roman army will enter the city of Jerusalem. And when they see that, it's time to head for the hills. Don't pack your suitcase. Don't go back for a change of clothes. Run, because judgment is here, and it's going to come swiftly. Let me show you a picture from our trip to Israel. These are some of the stones from the Temple Mount, the ones the Romans threw off the Temple Mount. Jesus said not one stone will be left upon another. And as you can see, Jesus was quite a prophet. These stones have been left on the streets of Jerusalem for 2,000 years as a reminder to the Jews that God punishes disobedience and unfaithfulness. History books tell us that most of the people in Jerusalem in AD 70 were not ready for Titus' invasion, or they apparently underestimated the destruction. A lot of people lost their lives in the Roman siege of Jerusalem. And then Jesus, with the 12, sets out to answer their second question. What are the signs of the end of time? And Jesus says flatly, no signs. There will be no signs. Only the Father knows when that will be. Even I, the Son, do not know. Therefore, Jesus says in verse 44, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Now that verse is kind of a theme verse, if you will, for the three parables then that follow in our text. One from yesterday and then two more from today's reading in chapter 25. This is a theme verse. We see a little parable there at the end of chapter 24, yesterday's reading, about a wise and faithful servant, and then another servant who is foolish and wicked. They're both awaiting the return of the master to his house. Then in today's reading, we saw two parables, one about 10 virgins, 5 wise virgins, 5 foolish virgins. Their task is to light the way for the bridegroom's feast. They're waiting for the bridegroom to come. And then that's followed by a parable about 3 servants of a certain king who've been tasked with stewarding his wealth while he's away. The king comes back and he finds that 2 of the 3 servants have turned a profit with the money that he's left. And he calls those 2 servants good and faithful. But the 3rd servant, who operates in fear, did nothing with the money he was given to take care of. You might say he put it in a coffee can and buried it in his backyard. And what does the king call him? You remember? Wicked and lazy. Now I'm going to trust that you've already read these 3 parables since they were part of the assigned reading for yesterday and today. And you've probably heard any number of sermons on these 3 parables. And so what I'd like for us to do is just quickly draw some applications to use as we kind of go about our own lives in the week ahead. I once heard a preacher say that this is the motto for his life. Look at it with me. Live as though Jesus is coming back today. Plan as though Jesus is not coming back for 100 years. It's not a bad way to live, is it? Because one of two things is going to happen. Either Jesus is going to come back or we're going to die. And either one of those could happen today. We hear all the time about people who have a heart attack or a stroke or maybe a brain aneurysm that bursts in the brain. One minute they're standing there fine, the next minute they're lying dead on the ground. That could happen to us. And Jesus is coming back. That is a fact. And he will come like a thief in the night. There's not going to be a warning. There's not going to be any signs, and it could happen today. Therefore, Jesus says, keep watch. Be ready. And so in these three parables, we see a need for preparedness. It is important to be prepared. And understand that keeping watch doesn't mean sitting in a church pew and peering up at the sky waiting for what might happen next. No, watching and waiting means being prepared to take action. You know that I was recently out in California. My son out there has a new dog, part pit bulldog. Pretty good dog, incredibly strong jaws. I played tug of war with him for hours on end, it seemed like. He's a pretty good watchdog. If he hears somebody roaming around outside, he will bark. But one afternoon, we were all sitting there, and a breeze came up, and it blew the front door wide open. The dog barked one time and then ran into the powder room to hide behind the toilet. I mean, the dog diligently watches for signs of trouble, but then when trouble comes, he's not prepared to do anything about it. And folks, in the same way, you and I are to watch, but to do so with preparedness to act. We must think and behave as if today's the day. We live with that certain expectation. We live under the kingdom priorities of God, not the priorities of my kingdom. Like Paul writes to Titus, we, by the grace of God, say no to ungodliness and to the passions of the world. We stay prepared by living self-controlled and upright and godly lives. When? Today. Why? Because today might be the day. We must live prepared lives. We must also live responsibly. It is important to be responsible people. And that means I take responsibility for my actions. I don't blame somebody else for my failures and my sins. I own up to my failures and sins, and I learn from my failures and sins. I understand the responsibility for my actions lies with me alone. It's my choice. The buck stops here. I've been given the ability to make choices, and I am responsible for the choices I make. Therefore, being ready means choosing the good and doing it today. I have a choice. I can get drunk or I can stay sober. I can cheat on somebody today or I can serve that person. I'm not going to be like the wicked servant who says, Jesus is not coming back today. I'm not going to die today. So I might as well get drunk and beat up on these people who are weaker than me and take everything they have. No. As followers of Christ, we choose to do the right thing today because today might be the day. We live responsibly. And certainly that carries over into that next parable of those 10 virgins. We must stay ready to be responsible. In other words, it's important to maintain our readiness. Notice that both groups of girls, the wise ones and the foolish ones, take a snooze. They fall asleep while they're waiting for the king to return, the bridegroom. But these wise girls are sleeping very peacefully because they know they're ready. They thought things through ahead of time. They thought to themselves, I might need some extra oil just in case the bridegroom is late. The other girls had not prepared for that possibility. They didn't think ahead at all. See, church, here's the deal. If Jesus comes back today and we're not ready, it's too late. We've got to be spiritually prepared to meet Jesus all the time. When we're young, we think we're 10 feet tall and bulletproof, don't we? Oh man, I'm going to live another 70 years. I got all the time in the world to do what I want to do, and I'll worry about Jesus when I get old. I think that's one of the benefits of getting old, is we come to see that life is a very fragile thing that could be snuffed out at any moment. We got to be ready all the time, no matter what our age. And you might ask the question, well, how do we know we're ready? Well, we're ready when our relationships are in order. I'm talking about our relationship with God and our relationship with each other. That we're ready when we live in such a way that we know we wouldn't be ashamed if Jesus were to come right now. We know we're ready to meet Jesus when all our grudges have been acquitted, our hatchets are buried, and there are no more axes to grind. Again, Jesus is coming back, and that is a fact. And so living to please Jesus has its rewards today as well as tomorrow. Jesus says that no good deed is ever wasted. And church, good deeds is what we were created to do. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is productivity. It's important to be productive people. And certainly that's brought out in that final talent parable, isn't it? These first two servants turn a profit, and they are commended by the king. And notice that the second king was not expected to produce 5 talents like that first servant, but he was expected to be productive, and he was. And then we come to the third servant who buried the king's money, the one called wicked and lazy. And what's worse, he was cast into outer darkness, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so again, the Christian life is not lived in a church pew. It's lived in a world that needs Jesus. And you and I have been commissioned with sharing that good news to make disciples by telling people the story of Jesus, and those who come to faith in that story, baptizing them in the name of Jesus. And then to continue teaching those people until they're mature enough to go out on their own and make even more disciples. I have a preacher friend who believes strongly that one of the questions Jesus is going to ask us at the judgment is, who'd you bring with you? And that's a sobering question, I think. Who did you bring with you? Who did you tell about me? Who did you make into my disciple by sharing the good news and baptizing them in my name? Productivity. Church, without it, we're sunk. I don't know how we can interpret this parable any other way. And it's supported by yet another parable Jesus taught that talked about branches that are attached to the vine, but they don't produce fruit. What happens to those branches? They're cut off by the vine dresser, and they're cast into the fire. Understand that these 3 servants in that last parable were all servants of the king. The 1 talent servant was not an outsider at all. He professed to be an insider, a servant of the king, but in the end he was an outsider. He was cast into the outer darkness and was no longer allowed to be in the presence of the king. And so I have to ask the question, how many of us, servants of Jesus, will be called good and faithful at that last day? And how many of us will be called wicked and lazy and will no longer be allowed to be in the presence of the king? The Spirit has blessed each one of us with talents and abilities, and we are to use those talents and abilities to the glory of God and to the edification of the church. A buried talent is a waste of talent. May we be productive to the glory of Jesus, because we're all going to be held accountable by the King. May we stand before Him at that last day prepared and ready, responsible and productive, so that He might smile at us and say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter into your master's happiness." May we live every day expecting today to be the day. Jesus is coming. Have a blessed week.